Inside Florida Politics, powered by the USA Today Florida Network. President Joe Biden travels to Florida to assess Hurricane Helene damage. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris spar over the federal government's hurricane response. And Governor DeSantis says Florida doesn't need federal help with Helene recovery. Hello, I'm USA Today campaign reporter Zac Anderson, and those are some of the stories I'll be discussing today with Palm Beach Post politics editor Antontio and Gannett State Capitol reporter John Kennedy. John, right as we're recording this, Biden is in Florida to assess hurricane damage in the Big Bend region. Helene really was a gut punch to Florida. It's really heart-wrenching to see some of the images of flooding down here where I live in Sarasota. The beach communities have really been devastated all the way up to Cedar Key. The Tampa area, the coastline has seen historic storm surge. Biden's visit comes after a trip to the Carolinas on Wednesday, which also experienced extreme flooding. And we've seen a much higher death toll up there than in Florida, but also here in Florida as well. Some conservatives say Biden has been slow to respond to Helene, and they mocked him for spending the weekend after the storm at his beach house in Delaware. What do you make of the criticism?
Well, the timing of these presidential visits is always tricky. You don't want an entourage of the president, traveling staff, and Secret Service arriving and actually imposing another burden on a community that's struggling with disaster.
Yeah, the mayor of Asheville actually said that for Biden to come there was only one road open into the town, and they would have had to shut that road open for his security entourage, which would have been a real problem when people are trying to get out of there.
Yeah, so really, waiting a while makes sense. The definition of while, I guess, is, in dispute here. But, Republicans are using this pause and the response as, one more example of the theme that they've been using throughout this campaign, that the Biden administration is a failure, whether it's in border policy, the economy, and I guess now, Hurricane Helene recovery. But it seems like federal emergency supplies have been getting to the areas hit hardest. Of course, that's also a huge expanse across the Southeast from Florida through the Carolinas. So it's a big area that the government is trying to get to, and parts of the North Carolina area hit hardest by the storm and the floods that followed. It's extremely remote and hard to get in and out of at any time. But since we're a political podcast, we also have to note that, of the 7 presidential swing states, 2 of them, Georgia and North Carolina, have been victimized by Hurricane Helene. So, don't worry. Both parties are paying attention and doing what they can to assist with storm recovery.
Yeah, and really, criticism of Biden is criticism of Kamala Harris because she's part of the Biden administration, right? I mean, they're kind of trying to tie her to what they say is a slow recovery effort.
Yeah, it's going to blow back on Harris, whatever's going on right now. You've seen this in just about every political appearance. The vice presidential debate most recently, that Tim Walz in this case was tied by J.D. Vance, the Republican nominee, to Harris, and then to the Biden administration and everything that happens there, whether it's the price of cornflakes in supermarkets or how people's take-home pay has turned in the last 4 years. So, Harris is responsible for it all, and Tim Walz as well.
Antonio, what do you make of this debate?
Well, we kind of have been seeing this all along with every disaster. Now, it becomes kind of this political football. And in particular in Florida, I remember in 2004, after the hurricanes there, and you had then President George W. Bush, who was up for re-election that year, handing out ice with his brother, the governor of Florida, right after the storms during that storm season. So the optics here, if we recall back to 1992 in the Clinton George H.W. Bush campaign, the famous, after Hurricane Andrew hit Miami, the famous "Where's the cavalry" line that's really spoke to the fact that there was a sense that the federal government had not shown up. And at that time, President George H.W. Bush was running for re-election against Bill Clinton and Ross Perot. So, look, this is, presidential politics and natural disasters are, how they're handled can be a very decisive factor in a presidential election. And right now, given the way as polarized as we are, the stakes are just so much higher.
And you mentioned George H.W. Bush. His son, George W. Bush, famously was pilloried for the federal government's response to Hurricane Katrina. I think Republicans are trying to make this into Biden's Katrina. Do you think that that's fair?
Well, the fact of the matter is that you can paint it that way, but it's not really. Look, it's kind of interesting. The Republicans are kind of treading an interesting line here, because at one end they're saying, we don't trust government institutions. We don't trust big government. It's socialism. I mean, how many times have we heard, Mr. Trump refer to the vice president as a communist, or Democrats as communists, radical left lunatics and fascists and so forth. And now you're saying that, well, no, the government's not doing enough. So they're treading their own interesting line here. But the fact of the matter is, what matters most is, what is the public perception? In the case of the 04 storms, the optics spoke to an engaged government out to help the people. And as you mentioned, the case of Katrina, it's the optics spoke to a government that seemed to be, dispassionate or lacking empathy with suffering in this city and in this region of Louisiana and New Orleans. So at the end of the day, it's the optics. And I remember in the Katrina, besides the famous "you're doing a heck of a job, Brownie" line that came back to haunt George W. Bush, but also that one photo of him looking at Air Force One as they were flying over the impacted areas in Louisiana, that also became this iconic optic again of a kind of a hands-off government that did impact George, his legacy as president.
Yeah. Up next, Trump and Harris spar over the hurricane response. And it's difficult, we haven't been covering it personally, what's happening on the ground in North Carolina, where it really seems like that is going to be a lot of the political football, because, it's as devastating as things were in Florida and other places. It looks like the death toll there is going to be extremely high for any type of natural disaster. So we'll see. I mean, those are very remote areas. They're hard to get to, especially when you have an active flooding situation. We'll see what the assessment is of the federal government's response. Antonio, we've already been talking about how political this got, and it got political really quickly. And I guess that's sort of the new normal for these disasters, and maybe not unexpected when you're in the home stretch of a presidential campaign like this. And John mentioned these are some critical swing states that got hit. You have Georgia and North Carolina, either of which could potentially decide the election. It's not just criticism of Biden, as we mentioned. It's also criticism of Harris. And there's sort of been a race to get on the ground and prove that you care about what's going on there. Trump was there first. I think it was Monday. Harris got to Georgia on yesterday, I believe, and she's continuing to assess the damage in that region. They've gone sort of back and forth about the hurricane response here. I guess I wonder, do you think this could impact the race? I mean, these are really important states.
Well, I think the conventional wisdom, the answer is yes. And I think, John kind of laid it out pretty well. What I would add would be two things. One is, it's not just, as we talked about, a political football. This is very strategic. This storm hit basically the areas of North Carolina, rural areas of North Carolina and Georgia that are kind of the classic American carnage regions, with the exception of Asheville, which is a little bit more affluent, but the Appalachians and rural Georgia are kind of the classic American carnage, forgotten people theme that Donald Trump has made the brand of his political brand. And so if you are on the Republican side, what you're trying to make the argument here that the lack of federal response speaks to what we've been telling you since the beginning, since we came down that golden escalator in 2015, that the government is not there for you. They don't care about you. They only care about the other, the they. If you're the Democrats, this is the opportunity to make the statement that this is why government exists, for this kind of national emergency. I've been befuddled a bit by how the Democratic ticket has kind of run away from that. Were you better off 4 years ago when we were in the middle of a pandemic, unemployment at 12, 14%, people fighting at Costco over toilet paper, and the mishandling of that national emergency at the time. Here's the opportunity to basically say, this is why government exists, to basically come to you in a time of need. And maybe they're not going to win over those red rural areas that are the base of the MAGA movement. But they could win over, for example, those suburban voters that are kind of in the middle and looking to see, is government there for me or not? And is government going to protect me or not? Is there a safety net for me or not? Those suburban voters that were so pivotal in 2020 that seem to be the ones on the fence right now, this could play to them. And it could say, yeah, you know what? How this turns out may be decisive for them.
And Antonio, Trump's criticizing the Biden-Harris administration for their response to Helene. He faced similar criticism during his time in office. There was the famous event where he went to Puerto Rico and he's doing the jump shot with the paper towels. And, Puerto Rico was really devastated by Hurricane Maria. And there was criticism of the federal government's response to that.
Well, yeah. And then there was also, remember the Sharpie, the cone with the Sharpie. Look, two things. Interesting that you raised that point of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, because earlier this week I was talking to DNC Chair Jamie Harrison. And part of the reason that they think that they can really make a race in Florida is appealing to the Puerto Rican electorate. And they're making that argument about the Hurricane Maria and the lack of a federal response there, and in some of the infrastructure spending that the Biden-Harris administration has made in Puerto Rico in the last 4 years. So it's kind of be interesting to see how that plays, particularly in the I-4 corridor across Florida with 1.1 million or so registered Puerto Rican voters. The other question here, though, that I think could seep into a lot of the congressional races is the National Flood Insurance Program, which is tied up in which could be used to help and be a safety net, and really could have, at least financially. The worst thing about these storms is the death toll. You cannot replace a life, as we have heard many times. But at least on the financial toll, the National Flood Program could be of real use to a lot of these rural areas that are at risk of flooding, and also even some of the suburbs here in South Florida and then across Florida. And that's actually tied up in a lot of partisan bickering in Congress. So you wonder if that will also seep into the 2024 campaign on the House races side.
John, Antonio mentioned that one reason the DNC thinks Florida could be in play is because of the Puerto Rican vote. But you look at the response, how the candidates, Trump and Harris, are responding to this hurricane. They're not coming to Florida. They're going to Georgia. They're going to North Carolina, which seems to be a sign that they know where the real battlegrounds are. Don't you think if Florida was really in play that you would see Trump and Harris in Florida looking like they're in charge of this?
Yeah, I think you would. You'd see the actual candidates here. As it is right now, we have President Biden, which is not bad, to have the president come to Florida. But, maybe there will be a circling around. But Florida, as so many of us have been saying, at least in North Florida, it seemed to have dodged the bullet. This is something that we go through these storms with such frequency now, and there's such mega storms that are getting hit here. Admittedly, parts of the Tampa Bay area are really bad still, but they, compare a little bit better than what we've seen, especially in North Carolina.
Up next, DeSantis says Florida doesn't need any more federal assistance.
And of course, DeSantis has grabbed this himself, with he's branded Operation Blue Ridge. The state's effort.
Let's talk about that, because DeSantis kind of made an unusual statement this week. He said, "We're fine here in Florida. We've got this under control. Go to North Carolina. They're the ones that really need the help." And he is even sending, as you said, Operation Blue Ridge. He's sending Florida resources to North Carolina, which is pretty unusual when Florida has been hit pretty hard. Of course, it looks like it is worse in North Carolina, especially with the deaths and people, needing rescue and people being cut off in these really remote areas. The death toll there is horrific, and it seems like it's going to just grow. But Florida was hit pretty hard too. The storm surge especially from like Cedar Key down to even where I live in Sarasota was historic. We haven't seen storm surge like this ever since record keeping. You're seeing basically the whole beach communities in the Tampa area, which are huge economic drivers, really devastated. And in Sarasota, Siesta Key, those areas were really saw a large amount of flooding. So for the governor to say we're fine, we send the resources to North Carolina, does that reflect the situation on the ground? I mean, it is worse in North Carolina.
It is, but I think there's a political play here too, because you have, his own people are likening this move to, what he did to get Floridians out of Israel after the Hamas invasion last October. So, a lot of this Operation Blue Ridge is, frankly, it looks very similar to the kind of mutual aid support that the state does with any state, following a disaster. But I think, again, by christening the effort with a military operation sounding name, it gives DeSantis a chance to flex, which
it makes him look like he's commander in chief, doesn't it? He's almost playing president here.
Yeah, and it kind of implies that he has to do this because of the inadequacies of the federal government and its response. It's another time for DeSantis to try to help Trump, which seems to frame a lot of the governor's actions these days. And as we're saying throughout this, storms are political. We've seen that in Florida with major hurricanes hitting the state recently in 2016, 18, and 22. These were all big election years in the state. And DeSantis, we recall, in 2022, he spent about a month of his reelection campaign responding to Hurricane Ian fairly successfully. And, shortly before, he wound up winning a second term as governor by the widest margin in Florida in 40 years. So maybe that response paid off for DeSantis. He looks like a man in command, and voters responded to that. But these storms, though, also renew talk of climate change. And DeSantis, like his predecessor, Senator Rick Scott, who is accompanying the president today to hard-hit Taylor County in Florida, DeSantis and Scott have resisted any efforts to blunt the impact of climate change on Florida. Instead, they've poured millions of dollars of taxpayer money into rebuilding and resiliency after these storms hit. That's kind of the Republican way. But voters' attention to climate change, it's kind of a bit of a roller coaster. It seems like people are very fixated on it when the storm hits and its immediate aftermath. But then, once the storms pass and people's memories fade, they just go back and living in these storm vulnerable coastal communities, complaining about why their insurance rates are so high. That seems to be the cycle in Florida, and the Republican leadership in this state is not doing anything to, have any kind of longer term impact on trying to reduce the potential vulnerability of the communities and also the potential impact of these storms.
Yeah, and one of the reasons these storms have been so devastating in recent years is they've really sort of metastasized. They've gone from Category 1 storms to Category 4 or 5 storms. Helene was a Category 4 when it hit, and I think it strengthened to a 4 over the course of 24 hours or something like that. It went from like a 1 to a 4. So you're seeing what they call rapid intensification, and that's a large part because the waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the ocean are really much warmer, above average than they typically are, and hurricanes feed off of that. So if climate change is warming the oceans, that could lead to much more powerful hurricanes. It was interesting. You mentioned, John, that people do sort of pay attention to this after the storms. JD Vance was asked about this at the vice presidential debate, and he gave a kind of a more I don't know how you would describe it, but he was recognizing. He said climate change is an important issue, and he said that that basically people are right to be concerned about these crazy weather patterns. He was not necessarily downplaying it, as we've seen Trump do, and Tim Walz came back and said, well, Trump describes climate change as a hoax. So what are you guys really doing to address this issue? Antonio, John mentioned that these storms have always been political, and that DeSantis is kind of using this to undermine Biden a little bit. Do you agree with that? Do you think that his efforts to send Florida resources to North Carolina are basically just sort of a not so subtle jab at Biden, and basically saying, well, if you're not doing a good enough job, we'll send our folks to help?
Well, obviously, that's one of it. But I think perhaps we can ask the question: is if this is as you and John were talking about this man in command theory, and him as the powerful executive, and really starting to try to refurbish his standing for potentially whatever comes his way in 2028. Now, the danger there is, and in sending resources to other states and making this grandstand play, if you will, is that he is overlooking what has been a lot of damage and really a lot of hardship in these areas of the Big Bend and in his home state. We had a reporter and a photographer out there last week, and they told some really heartbreaking stories. There are people in serious need there. Few of the people who, as our insurance reporter Ann Gegas is reporting, few of those most impacted financially have insurance backing. So they're kind of out on their own. They're essentially homeless. They've been left with basically penniless.
Right, and that's really the next crisis after this storm is the insurance.
Is the financial consequences. The loss of homes, the loss of the inability. Where do I go? And it's not like in some of these small towns. It's not like there's other structures you can go to in larger urban areas. Yeah, you have a severely impacted zone, but then you have other places that can provide you some safe harbor for a while.
Right. If you're in a rural area and your home is unlivable, there's not a whole bunch of other places you can go to live.
No, there's not. It's not. And again, as I keep harping on this, but many of these, that a lot of the people that Ann spoke with did not have windstorm coverage, because these are very low income areas where people could not afford the increases in insurance premiums, particularly because their homes were so close to the ocean, so close to the shore, but at the same time had not accessed the National Flood Insurance Program that would have covered a lot of their loss. So therefore they have nothing. So, it's great to say, hey, we're going to go to the rescue of people in North Carolina. I lived in North Carolina. I consider my second home. I would support any effort to help the people of Western North Carolina, but understand that there is need here in Florida as well, even though it's not to the level of in those states.
Yeah, and you bring up some really good points about the insurance issue. I think the Florida legislature has been grappling with that for many years, and they haven't come up with a solution, and this is only going to make it more difficult. Well, we'll leave it at that. That wraps up another episode of Inside Florida Politics. I want to thank our production guru, Rob Landers. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. We're out of here.